Israel, a small country stuck in the heart of the Middle East, a territory with just over 22,000 square kilometers, surrounded by historically hostile nations and one of the most unstable regions on the planet. But what few like to remember is that Israel is also the only nuclear power in the region, a secret known to everyone, but officially never confirmed. Today's video goes straight to the point. How can Israel use your nuclear weapons? And what does the dreaded expression really mean? Samson option? To understand the answer, we need to dive into a single military doctrine, and in a philosophy of iron-forged survival, blood, and historical memory. The history of the Israeli nuclear program begins in the 1950s, when the newly independent country faced constant wars with its neighbors. No natural resources like oil, and without reliable allies at the time, Israel realized that if you wanted to survive, you would need a letter in your sleeve. Something that could balance the geopolitical game. And it was like that, almost in the most absolute confidentiality, that the Dimona project was born. With France's technical help, and then with discreet support from other powers, Israel built a nuclear reactor in the Negev desert. Officially, the reactor served only for scientific research. But the truth, as almost everyone knows today, was quite another. To this day, Israel has never confirmed the existence of nuclear weapons. Neither did it denied. This calculated silence became known as the nuclear ambiguity policy. This strategy was sealed in a historical agreement with the United States in 1969, an unpaid pact in which Americans agreed not to press Israel to open their arsenal to the world, while Israel promised not to do public nuclear tests, nor being the first to declare possession of atomic weapons. Since then, politics is still the same. Israel simply does not comment. Now, let's get to what really matters. What is such a Samson option? The name makes direct reference to the biblical character Samson. He who, arrested and humiliated by the Philistines, chose to overthrow the temple columns, even though he knew he would die with his enemies. The idea behind this doctrine is brutal, direct, and no room for rodeos. If Israel is facing an existential threat, a situation where its destruction is inevitable, the country will retaliate with everything it has, even if it costs its own existence. This is not a doctrine of containment. It is not a strategic chess game like old Cold War policies between the US and Soviet Union. The Samson option does not follow the principle of guaranteed mutual destruction, that old concept in which two sides avoid attacking for fear of being annihilated as well. Here, the logic is different. If Israel is condemned, your enemies will be. This mindset has been part of Israel's strategic culture for decades, and it has deep roots in a factor that few foreign analysts often mention, but it is central to understanding Israeli military thinking: the memory of the Holocaust. Historical images of concentration camps, Jewish survivors after World War II, faces of children and exhausted elderly, all is part of collective trauma that still shapes the country's political and military decisions. With each military decision, with each defense plan, with every new generation of Israeli officers, one sentence is repeated almost like a mantra: never again. Never again the Jewish people will be brought to extermination. It will never be defenseless in the face of enemies determined to destroy its existence. So, over the decades, the Samson option has been shaped not only as a military response, but as a historical promise. One of the most critical occasions when Israel almost called its dreaded nuclear doctrine was during the Yom Kippur War in October 1973. At that time, Israel was surprised by a coordinated attack by two of his greatest enemies, Egypt and Syria. While the Israelis celebrated the most sacred holiday of the Jewish calendar, thousands of Arab soldiers crossed the borders, invading Sinai and the Gold Colinas. In a few hours, Israel's military situation became desperate. His troops were taken by surprise, the defensive lines began to crumble, and the risk of a total defeat seemed imminent. It was at this moment that, according to reports from military sources and historians, Israel put his nuclear forces on alert. At that time, the then Prime Minister Golda Meir and his war cabinet seriously discussed the possibility of using nuclear weapons as the last card to force enemies to retreat. Airplanes capable of transporting nuclear warheads would have been positioned on takeoff tracks. Jericho missiles, the main nuclear vectors of Israel, would have been prepared for launch. Although there has never been an official confirmation of these preparations, disqualified documents and testimonies of former officials suggest that the country was dangerously close to crossing the line that separates the dissuasion from real action. What prevented the use of nuclear weapons at that time was a combination of factors. First, the rapid regrouping of the Israeli forces on the battlefield, which managed to contain the enemy advance in the following days. Second, the U.S. Emergency Air Bridge organized, which sent thousands of tons of equipment and ammunition to reinforce Israeli troops. But the Yom Kippur episode made a clear lesson. Israel is willing to go to the last consequences if its existence is put at risk. Another aspect that differentiates the nuclear doctrine of Israel from other powers is the declared, albeit veiled disposition, to reach civilian targets in case of activation of the Samson option. Unlike countries such as the United States or Russia, which have a public doctrine initially focused on military and strategic targets, defense analysts point out that Israel would include entire cities on its list of targets if it was forced to act. The reasoning behind this extreme posture is simple and relentless. If the country is condemned, its enemies must also pay the highest possible price. This logic may seem cruel, but to Israeli strategists, it has a very clear function, serving as a psychological barrier. The message conveyed to enemies is direct. Attacking Israel with the aim of destroying it would mean a collective suicide. This policy is periodically reinforced with ambiguous statements by Israeli leaders. Although no prime minister or defense minister has directly stated that Israel has ready-made nuclear weapons for use, carefully chosen phrases imply that the capacity exists, and that the decision to use it, if necessary, is already taken. Indirect evidence of this capacity appears in episodes such as the 1979 Candle incident, when U.S. satellites detected a characteristic nuclear test flash in the southern Atlantic Ocean, near the coast of Africa. Although it has never been officially attributed to Israel, many analysts believe it was a joint test between Israel and South Africa, which at the time also developed its own nuclear program. Another source of crucial information came in 1986, when Mordecai Vanunu, a former coach of Dimona's nuclear facility, told the British newspaper The Sunday Times details about Israel's secret program. The photos and documents presented by Vanunu made it clear that Israel had not only a few warheads, but a considerable arsenal with a capacity for tens, perhaps hundreds of nuclear bombs. Because of these revelations, Vassi was kidnapped by the Israeli Secret Service, the Mossad, tried and condemned for betrayal. He spent 18 years in prison, most of them under isolation. Since then, Israel remains true to its ambiguity policy. But the signs are constant. Military head discourses, nuclear attack simulation exercises, continuous modernization of the Jericho missiles, and even the development of submarines with the ability to launch cruise missiles with nuclear warheads. All of this forms a mosaic of unvised information, but purposely left within the reach of analysts and, of course, the enemies. Today, more than 50 years after the beginning of the Israeli nuclear program, the Samson option remains one of the most delicate and feared themes of world geopolitics. Although the country has never done a public nuclear test, and not even officially admitted to nuclear weapons, the consensus among experts is practically unanimous. Israel has an arsenal ready for use. Estimates indicate between 80 and 400 nuclear warheads, enough to turn any regional confrontation into a global tragedy. What draws the most attention is how Israel's nuclear doctrine has evolved in recent decades. If before the threat was only theoretical, limited to scenarios of total destruction, today the Israeli dissuasive structure seems much more flexible and prepared for different response levels. This means that, in addition to the Samson option, which would represent the wide-scale use of nuclear weapons, it is rumored that Israel would also have made a second strategy: the use of limited and surgical nuclear attacks against strategic military targets as a way to give a warning before a larger climb. This possible change of posture has been evident during the growing tensions with Iran. In recent years, several Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, have made public speeches reinforcing that Israel will not allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. Although these pronouncements are always focused on the issue of Iran, they carry a hidden message. If necessary, Israel will act preventively, including means that have never been officially declared. In addition, Israel's second attack capacity, that is, the ability to retaliate even after a surprise nuclear attack, was reinforced by the introduction of Dolphin-class submarines made in Germany. These submarines are capable of launching cruise missiles with nuclear warheads, operating invisibly anywhere in the oceans. This guarantees Israel the ability to retaliate even if its territory is devastated. Recent statements by Israeli political and military figures maintain the same tone of calculated ambiguity. In interviews, when asked about the nuclear arsenal, the almost standard answer is, Israel knows how to defend itself. Few words, but with a huge weight. It is a clear message to all enemies of the region. Israel will not passively wait for its destruction. A detail that reinforces this perception happened in 2021, when the then Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of Israel, Aviv Kochavi, stated that the country is prepared to deal with existential threats with all available means. Although the phrase may seem generic, to military analysts who closely follow Israeli defense policy, it is an indirect confirmation of the continuity of the Samson option. But the question that remains is, in an increasingly unstable world, with new conflicts emerging and the constant risk of unexpected climbing, which could indeed make Israel press the button, the most likely scenario remains that of a large-scale conventional war, involving multiple enemies simultaneously and threatening the country's territorial survival. Another possible trigger would be an attack with weapons of mass destruction by an enemy like Iran if it gets nuclear capacity. It is also speculated that a devastating attack with high-precision ballistic missiles, capable of neutralizing Israel's political and military leadership in a first blow, could lead to immediate activation of the Samson option as a desperate retaliation. The psychological factor is another fundamental component. Israel lives on a state of constant warning, with the reminder that in recent history has already faced real attempts at annihilation. Collective trauma, distrust in international protection guarantees, and military self-sufficiency philosophy reinforce the logic that if the worst scenario comes, Israel will prefer to take their enemies along instead of disappearing alone. Closing this video, the great truth is that the Samson option is not just a military strategy. She is a symbol, a silent warning, a reminder that behind diplomatic meetings, moderate discourses, and official silence policy, there is a country that, when forced to the limit, is willing to ensure that its destruction never happens without devastating consequences for the world around it. If you like this content and want more videos about geopolitics, military history, and secret strategies, be sure to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next episodes. Until next time.